Welcome back to Search Marketing Academy, everybody. Today's guest is Giulia Panozzo. She's a neuroscientist turned SEO marketer. I'm really excited to have her here speaking about the science behind how people make decisions and how people buy things online. Giulia, welcome to the show. I'm really excited to have you on. You coming from neuroscience into SEO is really interesting. You, like many of my previous guests, did not begin your career in marketing. You began your career in neuroscience. And actually, you might be the first trained scientist that I've had on the show. Tell me a little bit about why you chose to move into SEO and how that transition happened.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be part of the show. So it was one of those decisions that came by chance and by necessity. I think at the time I wasn't even aware that I was getting, into an SEO career. I studied neuroscience in Italy, and after 5 years of education in Italy, you can become a licensed psychologist, but not before you have done a full year of free traineeships. So I did my first 6 months in Italy at the Department of Neuroscience and at the hospital, and then I had a scholarship to come to the UK and finish my traineeship at the university, at Goldsmiths University. The scholarship covered, it was meant to cover 6 months, but realistically, it was 2,000 euros in London for 6 months. So I needed to find another job. And I had the opportunity to be a translator, a freelance translator on the side for fintech in London. And then they just liked me. They thought they needed somebody to take care of SEO because they wanted somebody with my eye for detail. And they put me to a really important task, which was like going through links, external links and external mentions of the company, and like reaching out to webmasters to manually change the links. Now I realized that was not a really important task, but at the time it felt like, oh wow, I'm doing something amazing. It was basically by necessity and by chance. And then I just stuck around because I felt empowered by the learnings, by learning something new. I found a way to channel my learnings. And at the same time, I also struggled a bit with finding PhDs in London because I really wanted to stay in London. But the timing was not quite right. And also the opportunities could not really match the career in digital. So yeah, here we are.
You've made quite a few leaps in your career since then. I'm sure you're doing bigger and more important things in marketing, but talk to me a little bit about, we hear frequently about how marketing is very psychology driven and there's so much involved about how people think and how they're biased towards certain things. But what I really want to know is how much of that is in our control as marketers, and where's the balance between what we can influence and how much of it is shaped by somebody's personal experiences?
Yeah, I think there's the tendency to overestimate how much it is in our control, especially when we think about psychology of marketing or neuroscience. There's this tendency to believe that, with one word, we're going to have users jump through loops of fire, which is not really the case. It's a bit more nuanced than that. I think that as marketers, when we apply psychology concepts and learnings, we just enable decisions to be made easy in an easier way. So, for example, a lot is driven by decisions that we're not really aware we're making. So, for example, when we focus our attention, sometimes we filter out some stimuli and we're not aware that we're filtering those out. So we can leverage those learnings to drive the attention. And that's something that's in our control as marketers, I guess, because, users are often fall victim of this like sort of automatic shifts of the attention. However, there's also there's also experiences, personal experiences and learnings, especially that drive decision making. So neuroplasticity, for example, is something that really, as humans, we have to our avail to drive these sort of learnings. We learn how to rewire certain associations into our brain, which is great for us, and it enables us to learn from our mistakes. So that's the reason why marketers cannot only rely on, tip and tricks to get the users to do what they want, because that's not really the case. If so as a user, say that you have a negative experience once on a website, you won't go back to that one. So as a marketer, you might have, enabled them to make a decision once, but then it's like the ball's really not in your court when they had a negative experience. So I think it's shaped by experiences as well.
Everybody knows the really big ones like the sunk cost fallacy and loss aversion bias. But as somebody who comes from a trained background, what are some of the biases that you implement in your work?
As you mentioned, there's so many biases that we just have like really the choice if we want to learn more about them. I think the ones that I mention more in my work and the ones that I tend to use more. So some of them are more related to classic decision making as we know it, like the sort of conscious or subthreshold decision making. The other ones are more related to information processing. So some of these, for example, are the serial position effect, which is when we so given a list of words, for example, we tend to remember the ones that are presented first and the ones that are presented last. And that doesn't only apply to words, but it applies to objects that are presented on a page. And even it applies to arguments that are presented when we are being persuaded by somebody. So we just tend to basically overestimate the first and the last argument in order to base our decisions. So that's something that I personally like to use a lot because it's very easy, even in our job as SEOs. Say that you have your copy, stress the important message at the beginning and at the end, really, and that makes it also more accessible because not all the people will go through it all, right? It also has, as we know, a sort of influence on rankings because historically the above the fold is also what gets more attention from search engines. So that's one that I like to use. Other sort of information processing biases that I like to use are the numerical biases. And then there's another couple of information processing biases that I like to use, which are associated with the numerical domains. So, for example, there's two effects. One that's been isolated and called the size effect, and the other one's being called the distance effect. So, the distance effect says that it's easier to judge which number is larger in a couple of numbers if the distance between them is bigger. So, like it's related to how we are thought to think about numbers. So it's associated to theories on the mental number line. And the other effect is the size effect, which says that given two numbers, it's easier to estimate which one is larger if they're small numbers relative to large numbers. So if they're 2-digit numbers as compared to like 3 or 4-digit numbers. And in both cases, what's important to remember is that as magnitude increases, as we're talking about bigger numbers, it's harder to estimate differences. And a lot of, literature in marketing has been stressing how we should be using bigger numbers. And that's kind of, like to drive more sales because it's, you're kind of tricking the users into thinking that they're saving much more. However, the way that I like to use it is the opposite way. So what I normally recommend, especially when we're talking about the very early stages of information processing, or like even when we're looking at results on the SERP, I would always advocate for using percentages or fractions for savings, for example, because they're faster in terms of reaction times for users to be estimated. And, I think it might not be the best, or even like it might not be the most popular opinion, but I believe right now there's a lack of trust. There's a crisis with trust for brands, and tricking users into thinking they're saving more hurts you in the long term. So I think if we make the perception of the saving much faster, it's in their hands to decide whether they want to proceed with us. And if you're not offering a saving that's high enough for them, then probably they wouldn't go for you in any case. And then there are two that are probably more related to decision making as we know it, and we're probably all familiar with those: negativity bias and confirmation bias. Negativity bias, I'm actually studying a bit more now. I'm doing a deep dive because I want to understand a bit better how we can leverage the learnings from negativity bias. So it's when we tend to associate more value to something negative as compared to the positive counterpart, even though they carry the same emotional load. The two objects or stimuli carry the same emotional load. And that's being associated with, theories about survival and evolution. And in general, it seems to be confirmed as an asymmetry at the neural level as well. So it's really interesting the way that we display these bias. And negativity bias can also be displayed as early as in the SERP. So there have been studies isolating how we respond more to negative headlines. So, for example, with better CTRs for something in the SERP that mentions worst or most dangers, stuff like that. But it also affects the rest of the journey because as a user, if I have a negative experience on a website, I tend to remember that much more than all of the positive that I've experienced before. And that has been shown to stop the journey at the point of checkout. So users have already spent a lot of time on the website. They've already started evaluating deals or, started processing all of the information that's at their avail. But if they come into, 4 or 4 pages, overwhelming flow or contradicting information or not enough information, really, they just tend to abandon at the stage of checkout. So that's something that we should be aware of as brands. And what I like to advocate for is work with the rest of your teams, because obviously, as SEOs, we can do only so much in our own domain. And then we just have to collaborate with UX, with every other team to make sure that we are making the journey valuable and easy for the user, because otherwise they'll just remember the bad part. Yeah, and finally, confirmation bias. It's another one that I think is really something that we should be aware of, because so we tend to just confirm, or we tend to associate more value to information that confirms our existing beliefs. And this has got to do, for example, with, there's an example that I like to bring, which is from travel brands, for example, post-pandemic. You're a user, you're looking to go on holiday again. There's a massive surge on travel-related queries. And one of them that I could find was is Expedia legit, for example? But that goes for every brand and not only in travel. A lot of people just look for reliability, right? And if a user doesn't find something from the brand on the SERP, they will rely on somebody else's information because that's the only sort of information that they have available. And the existing beliefs that they come to the search with will determine if they are going to believe whoever says that, no, Expedia is not legit or this brand is not legit, versus the other one that confirms a positive experience. And what I like to say is that if somebody needs to look into, your reliability, they probably are not familiar with you as a brand. And they tend to be, as we've seen with negativity bias, they tend to be more prone to avoid losses and to avoid negative experiences. So they might go for, staying away from you. And the way that we can leverage learnings from confirmation bias is making sure that as brands, we proactively address the customer concerns, because that's information that we have available. Stuff related to, sure, are we legit? Are we reliable? Do we have a customer promise that we can put very early on in the journey as an additional piece of information? Can we provide information on returns or shipping, or like even if we're based in the country that the user is based in, for example? I think there's a lot of information that brands have available, but they are not displaying because they think it's obvious. And it might be obvious for somebody that's familiar with them, but it's not obvious to new users.
I'm always fascinated when I look at my own decisions and how differently it contradicts what I actively believe in. But sometimes my actions are so different from um, what I actually think I want to do. So when you flip it that way as a marketer, it's really interesting to see how people really make choices. You mentioned a lack of trust in the market currently, right? And not tricking people, being transparent, being honest with people. Let's talk a little bit about ethics when it comes to shaping the way people think or influencing the way people think. It's really dangerous ground. You can almost brainwash people in some instances, and we've seen how quickly social media can warp people's perception of reality. And I think marketing certainly plays a role in that. What are your thoughts when a marketer is employing strategies and cognitive models? Where does the line get drawn in terms of what are your responsibilities as a marketer? What dangers do you need to avoid?
Yeah, so I think as marketers, we have the duty to connect with the customers and nudge them in a direction that they might already want to go. I don't believe in shaping their behavior or changing existing choices. I think we're just uh, bringing existing choices into thresholds, right? Over thresholds so that they can be acted upon. It is dangerous to rely on on tricks, but not only for the user. Really, it's dangerous for brands as well, because I think it's really hard after after a negative experience, or after even some piece of bad press, for example. It's really hard to reinstate that trust. It's much easier to gain it in the first place. And I think it's, we need to be aware of who we're marketing towards, who our audience is. Obviously, there are certain industries that are more dangerous than others. If we're like playing on people who have addictions, for example, or that have impairment to some extent in the decision making department, we should be aware as marketers that, where our limits are. I don't think personally I would feel comfortable in using marketing psychology in those specific industries. But in other less controversial situations, I guess it kind of goes without saying that you shouldn't be tricking your user. And also, I don't think we have enough power to do so. Even like, again, I think we tend to overestimate how much we can do based on the audience that we have in front of us. Obviously, there will be more vulnerable people that will be more susceptible to our to misleading messages if we were to use misleading messages. But in the majority of situations, we would have to do with people that already want to do probably a decision. We're just making it easier for them.
And I think with the rise of influencer campaigns in organic and paid marketing, I think it becomes a very slippery slope, especially when you're dealing with mega influencers like the Kardashians, for example. If you're a big brand working with someone like that, people who actually have the ability to shape people's thought patterns and buying behavior, then it becomes a lot more important. But I agree with you. And I'm not in e-commerce, I sell software. Fully agree with you that we have a lot less influence than we think we do.
I think motivation also plays a part in in users when they're making a decision. There's this model that's still valid today. It was built in the 80s, and it's called elaboration likelihood model. It's a theory according to which based on our motivations and our level of personal investment, we tend to rely more on the quantity or quality of arguments that are presented to us. So if our personal investment is lower, then we tend to rely more on, like the tricks that influencers and marketers might present our way. However, if the investment is higher, and we're talking maybe about like even, monetary investment, then we tend to rely on the quality of arguments. And I think, especially when we think, about, influencer marketing right now, we're not new to that as users, and I think we know now how to discriminate to some extent. A lot of the stuff that comes my way on TikTok, for example, I cross-check on Reddit, because I want people to confirm their experiences. And I think I wouldn't put the same level of effort if we're talking about, £1 sort of investment, or even if I'm, signing up for a free tool. However, as the investment gets higher, then we tend to rely more on, just like the quality, we tend to do more research. So I think, influencer marketing as well has got, especially with vulnerable minds that might be younger, for example, might have more power than it has on other people. But in general, I think we have the tendency to discriminate and to do more research as well.
When we think about bias, right, it's not just the bias of the person considering a purchase from our brands, but there's also bias that we exhibit as marketers when we interpret data, when we make decisions, or when we look at information, or even when we trust our instinct. Is there some advice that you have for marketers on how to keep our own biases in check so that we can do good objective work?
I like to rely a lot on data. Again, you can trust data to a certain extent, and there's always like certain factors among which biases that come into play. So I think having data on one hand and outsider perspective as well can, already sort of isolate, or like can make us aware of certain bias we might have. I think it's dangerous when we make decisions based on our own, our only own experiences and learnings and motivations. For example, one thing that if we go back to the SEO word specifically, sometimes you put up a test and you want it to do well because you propose that change, and you really want to show your stakeholders that your idea worked. And sometimes it will, data will show that it's working, and sometimes it will show that it's not working. And I think as marketers and as SEOs, we always try to, make sure that we can find ways and loops to show that, it's working, or like the traffic is up or positions are lower, etc. But we need to be just aware that sometimes it's not that way. So the way that I try to cut away my own confirmation bias is, having a real set of data that I can analyze, and then having on the other side all of the things that happened in between. So say, for example, that, I implemented a test on the 14th of April, and then 10 days later, engineering did another release, and I see an upward curve a month in. I need to be aware, with my worksheet where I log in all of the implementations, I need to be aware that might not have come from my own implementation, might have been like these other engineering thing going on. So I think having a real clear log of your implementations, your data, and whatever you're using for your job is one. And the second thing is definitely having a support net and a soundboard for whatever you're trying to decide. Especially, I'm not telling for small decisions, but when it comes to big decisions, you need to make sure that you're taking into account a lot of the other perspectives. Again, there might be bias there as well, because, social settings might affect the way that people express their decisions. They might not necessarily change their mind, but they might express it in a way that's more that conforms to what the rest of the group is thinking. But I think in general, organizations should be aware of these sort of common biases and work towards diversifying the sort of people that are working together as well. Because, if you put together the same people that come from the very same upbringing, the same school and whatever, they will have the sort of the same learnings, right? But they won't be able to bring a new perspective. And that's something that I'm also sort of branching into, making the web more accessible. So we need to make sure that we include not only in our decision making and in our group setting, but also in our studies, some sort of diversity, so that we can have the tools to cater for all.
Giulia, this has been a great chat. If, like me, people are interested in learning more from you, where should they follow you?
So on Twitter, I'm Sequins and Search, because I'm a figure skater on the side. So sequins have been a part of my life since forever. So yeah. And then on LinkedIn, I'm Giulia Panozzo. And I also started my own website now, neuroscientive.com, where I put my learnings. I'm right now doing a series of articles based on the talk that I gave at Brighton and at the Women in Tech SEO. So stay tuned for that, because there will be more learnings